Russians have likely resumed use of the railway line of the illegally constructed Crimean Bridge and are transporting fuel, which is currently in short supply in Crimea, to the peninsula. This opinion was expressed by Ukrainian Navy spokesman Captain 3rd Rank Dmitry Pletenchuk during a telethon broadcast. According to him, there are currently two main problems in Crimea: fuel and water. There are plenty of complications there actually. Recently, information emerged, which I can't yet confirm, that they've started using the Crimean Bridge specifically for the purpose of transferring fuel, Pletenchuk said. He explained that this is due to damage to the railway in the temporarily occupied part of southern Ukraine. According to the military man, it is now known that at least the civilian population of the peninsula is experiencing fuel shortages. Of course, the military doesn't get its fuel from space either, and accordingly, this could affect those directly involved and the units carrying out their missions. Therefore, the first problem is, of course, fuel. The second problem, of course, is water. Another dry summer is also affecting not only agriculture but also everyday life. Furthermore, explosions occur periodically in Crimea. Of course, these explosions occur at military facilities, says a Navy representative. According to Pletenchuk, the Crimean Bridge is critically important for the Kremlin, not so much in terms of infrastructure as it is ideological. He added that in addition to being a transportation hub, the bridge also has an energy supply. He added that there are no collateral damage to civilians during such explosions. As reported, Petro Andriushchenko, head of the Center for the Study of the Occupation of Ukraine, reported that Russian occupiers have resumed the transfer of military cargo via the Crimean Bridge railway line, which has long been inactive due to previous damage. According to Andriushchenko, the transportation began due to problems with communication through the temporarily occupied part of the Zaporizhzhia region, where the railway has been out of service for over a month. Andriushchenko explains that transportation across the Crimean Bridge began due to problems with communication through the temporarily occupied part of the Zaporizhzhia region, due to the railway line through the occupied Zaporizhzhia region being out of service for over a month. The Russians are forced to return the bridge to military use. This once again turns it not just into a totem, but a military target, the center's director noted. In these circumstances, the Ukrainian military targets the bridge.
In the wake of the senseless murder of Charlie Kirk, a lot of Americans may have seen polls that imply a shocking number of Americans support political and violence in one form or another. The reality is these polls are misleading, says Ryan Kennedy, professor of political science at The Ohio State University. For example, one recent poll found that 40% of Democrats supported use of force to remove President Trump from office, and 25% of Republicans supported the use of the military to put down protests against President Trump's agenda. These numbers don't reflect how Americans actually feel, Kennedy said. The problem is that pollsters rarely, if ever, ask people what they think the questions they are being asked mean. Kennedy and his colleagues at Ohio State did a poll of 520 Americans in mid-September that used artificial intelligence to ask meaningful follow-up questions, including asking people what they thought the questions meant and asking them to clarify their answers. When they did that, less than 8% of Democrats supported violence to remove President Trump from office and less than 3% of Republicans supported the violent use of the military to put down peaceful protests. There is no large well of support for violence amongst either political party or their supporters, Kennedy said.
In the wake of the senseless murder of Charlie Kirk, a lot of Americans may have seen polls that imply a shocking number of Americans support political and violence in one form or another. The reality is these polls are at best misleading. At worst, they're contributing to the tensions that are tearing apart the United States. We did research trying to delve further into what people meant when they answered these survey questions. And what we found is that, not surprisingly, very, very few Americans actually support political violence in any way, shape, or form. For example, there was a poll that was published in the New York Times and a number of other media outlets that suggested that 40% of Democrats supported the use of force to remove President Trump from office. It turns out that when you ask people what they meant by use of force, or what they thought the scenario would be that would involve this use of force, they weren't talking about violent removal. 65% of those people were actually thinking of things like impeachment or invocation of the 25th Amendment. So legal things that would force President Trump from office, not actual use of force. When you take out all of these people who are talking about things like legal means or nonviolent means, or actions that might involve particular scenarios, really what we're talking about is 8% who actually are talking about any kind of violence. In mid-September, we asked 520 people the same questions that were asked in another poll. They purported to show that 40% of Democrats supported use of force to remove President Trump from office, and 25% of Republicans supported the use of the military to put down protests against President Trump's agenda. What we found was that it was less than 8% of Democrats who actually interpreted use of force as meaning violent means to remove President Trump from office. And it was less than 3% of Republicans that were talking about violent use of the military to put down peaceful protests. Put simply, the way that we were interpreting those numbers was not at all the way that respondents were interpreting the questions. We rarely, if ever, actually ask people, what do you think this question means? What do you think that terms like use of force, deployment of the military, what kind of scenarios are popping into your head when I use those terms? And because of that, the results that we get can be wildly misleading. We may think that people mean one thing, but when we ask them what they mean, it turns out they mean something completely different. And what we've done at Ohio State is we've developed and utilized artificial intelligence to allow us to ask people at scale, what do you mean when you say this? And then to be able to analyze their answers and get an interpretation of what it was they meant to say when they gave this answer on that survey question. Today, we have much more sophisticated artificial intelligence that can ask meaningful follow-up questions, asking people things like, what do you think this term in the question meant? What kind of scenario were you thinking of when you answered the question this way? What do you think this question would entail, and when would you have answered that question differently? And then on the back end, we have the ability now to use computers to interpret people's answers in a way we didn't have before. We've seen recently where politicians and government officials have used these surveys to try and justify crackdowns on teachers, on academics, on people's social media posts. And the reality is that these surveys are just completely misleading. There is no large well of support for violence amongst either political party or their supporters. These are your fellow Americans we're talking about. When you hear something saying that 2 out of 5 Democrats who you would randomly find are supporting use of violence, no, that's not the case. And you know that's not the case. And we shouldn't use this stuff without understanding why people are giving the answers that they are, without giving people the benefit of the doubt. And that's what I think the bottom line really comes down to, is that people wield these numbers as weapons. But the numbers are misleading, and we need to call it out when our numbers are lying to us. My name is Ryan Kennedy. That's spelled R-Y-A-N, last name K-E-N-N-E-D-Y. I'm the Timoshev Chair of Data Analytics and a professor of political science at The Ohio State University.